is Scotty Roberts. Scotty, how are you, buddy?
Hey, Shawn, I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you. I have to admit, this is one show that I've really been excited to actually get underway.
Oh, wonderful. Well, it's an exciting topic because the book itself, The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim, it's all about things that started as biblical studies for me, and then I found out it segues into so many other ancient cultures and ancient religions where all these circles start merging at the edges, and you get a much bigger story and a much bigger picture than just a Bible story.
So, quickly though, anybody out there that's heard the term Nephilim, those that have read some of the Bible, or just a little bit like myself, they may have come across the term in the book of Genesis. What is the Nephilim?
Well, the Nephilim are, it's a word that has become synonymous with ancient alien studies on one form or another. And these are, some people don't even relate it to the biblical Nephilim. It's just become such a pop word in these studies. You find it in everything from the heavy research of biblical studies to studies of ancient aliens to comic books and even movies made about these characters. And all they really are, the Nephilim, are just simply the offspring. That's one word that you can use to describe them. They're the offspring. They're a race, a hybrid race, if you will, that was created by the intermingling of non-human entities with human women. And this is a story that starts in the book of Genesis, chapter 6. And I chose that as my starting point for this whole study and research because that's the source of the word, is the Hebrew Bible. It's a Hebrew word. Nephal is the base word, and it means to fall, to come down, to descend, to leave one's estate and go to another. And then there's broader applications. And then the him ending, the I-M, is the Hebrew plural suffix that's tacked on a word to denote plurality. So it just simply becomes those who fell, those who came down, those who left their first estate, and so on. And in my study of this, they appear in Genesis chapter 6 and in a couple of other very obscure little places throughout the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. And so as we start talking about this, and as you read the book, you have to keep firmly in your mind that I stick to that Genesis account and where it spreads out from there as the starting point, because this is the source point. And what I found, I can jump to the quick, it's almost like telling the end of the story. The Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament, really becomes just a version of this story of these beings. It's their version with their names put on it and their characters that are added. But then you will find these accounts of these beings throughout almost every other ancient culture. And one thing I didn't know when I first learned about the Nephilim, even though it's found in the same chapter, it's the prelude or the preamble to the story of Noah and the Ark, which you find in Genesis chapter 6. They're really just the beginning point. It takes on the whole story of the Ark story and Noah takes on a whole different tone once you study out who these characters are, who their parents are, and so on. And then you start comparing it to outside sources, like the book of Enoch, which is a part of Hebrew scripture, but it was one that was deemed non-canonical, or there was so much controversy they could not come to unanimous decisions over whether or not it was scripture, that it was booted out of the Bible under Constantine's councils in the 300s. And so they pushed it out into the apocryphal books, not because they didn't believe it was true, but because there was enough controversy over it, and the mandate at these councils was to come to unanimous decisions on what books would be included in the Bible. And so out of hundreds of them, they ended up with the 66 books of the Bible. And the book of Enoch ended up being booted out because they could not decide if it was scripture or not. And there was a controversy over it. And Constantine's mandate was, you will find unanimity or else. And so this is what the church did underneath the rule of Constantine. And so these characters, by this name alone, are Hebrew characters, and it gives the Hebrew version of what these characters are. And it basically says this. In the book of Genesis, chapter 6, there's like 4 verses that talk about the Nephilim, and it is very neutral. It doesn't say they were good or bad or anything like that. just gives the account, almost as I've got to mention this, the author of Genesis says, I've got to mention this because I can't not mention it. But where he spends 4 verses talking about them, you go to the book of Enoch, and Enoch spends chapter after chapter after chapter talking about these beings, filling in all the details. And the story you get of the flood story is really a story that is greatly affected by the story of the Nephilim. As a matter of fact, in the Hebrew, when you start looking into the original language in which these things were written, you find a very, very different twist on the story of Noah and the ark than you find in, say, Sunday school. And what were we taught about Noah and the ark when we were kids in Sunday school? Well, God was pissed off at the wickedness of man, and so he's going to destroy all the earth and everybody in it, save for the one righteous man and his family who he told to build this big barge, and that he, God, would bring all these animals 2 by 2 miraculously to this ark, and there would be this great salvation. And then the world would suffer under this great deluge. Now, the interesting thing is that story of Noah and the ark, take out the names and the exact events, and you will find that story mimicked almost 600 times in ancient cultures, different religions, different cultures. They all have these flood stories, but common to them all is this idea that non-human or spirit entities came down to the earth, intermingled with human women, had offspring, and some deity or higher power was angered by this and wanted to wipe them all out at utilizing this great flood story. You have nothing different in the book of Genesis.
That's one thing I wanted to ask you there, Scotty, is when you're talking about these beings, whether spiritual or whatever, that are descending onto our planet Earth, do you believe, based on the research that you've done over your entire life, do you believe that these beings could be angels, or are they aliens? Because, back in the day, it'd be really hard to understand that there could be beings on another planet. So they might be depicted as angelic. What is your opinion on this? What came down?
My opinion is this. Well, first of all, you got to go to the text and see what the text says in the biblical account, which is the source point. And the text says, and in those days the sons of God came down and intermingled with the daughters of men and had children by them, and they were known as the Nephilim, the heroes of old and the men of renown. And it says, and they were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came to the daughters of men and had children by them. Boom, end of account. Well, the sons of God is the first starting point into finding out who these guys were. The sons of God, in the Hebrew, they're called the Bene Ha-Elohim, and they are the sons of Elohim, or the bequeathed of Elohim, or those who are of the Elohim. And Elohim is the name used for God in the Old Testament almost 3,000 times, amongst many other names used for God: El Elyon, El Shaddai, Elohim, the angel of the Lord, things like this used all throughout the Old Testament. The one used the most was Elohim. And Elohim, much like I described the word Nephilim, when you break it down in the Hebrew, El is the base name for God, E-L, and then Him, or Elohim, him being that same plural suffix tacked on the end of a word like you find in Nephilim, making the word plural. So you've got the word Elohim, the name used for God 3,000 times in the Hebrew Old Testament, literally means God of or among many gods. And this is a cast of characters who came down, and I can establish that if we have time with several other... You go back to the Garden of Eden story, you go up into the Psalms, and you find out that there's this big picture going all through the Old Testament establishing who the Elohim are. So these Elohim, these characters who came down to the earth, they interbred with human women. In the book of Enoch, the parallel book to this, which expands on this story greatly, has some of the same language, and it talks about how the Bene Ha-Elohim, or as Enoch refers to them, the Watchers, descended down to the earth, and they saw that the human women were beautiful, and they chose any of them they wanted to, and they cohabited with them, and they had children with them, and they also brought the forbidden knowledges of heaven or of the gods and taught it to the humans. And this was the great sin. And so you've got this big spiritual religious story in the religious books of the Hebrews. But what I think, when you start comparing it to all the other accounts out there of these types of beings who intermingle with human women, and a great flood takes place as a result, as a punishment for it, or as a way to destroy this race, what you find is is there's a common thread running through all of these. If you've got different names, different characters, different types of beings, but all the same story, the common thread running through is there were non-human entities, spirit beings, if you will. You can look at some of these stories and say they're fact, and I believe them by faith, or you can say they're allegorical, or they're metaphorical, or they're mythological, or they're encoded messages wrapped up in these stories. Whatever you have, you find that I think what ancient mankind did was when they encountered these non-human beings that came down, which are, again, in over 600 different cultures out there, you've got these non-human beings that I think ancient mankind looked at and said, these are gods, these are angels, these are devils, these are demons, these are everything in between. And over the centuries, or millennia even, if you will, they were called, these Nephilim were referred to as the fallen angels. You know, they refer to Satan and Lucifer, the fall of Lucifer in heaven, and all the angels that fell with him, and these must be the fallen angels. The only problem with that notion is that the word for angel in the Hebrew is never used anywhere in connection to the Elohim. As a matter of fact, the Elohim are beings that are not ever called angelic, which is the word malach, or malachi, or malachi, to describe plurality of angels. They're referred to as Elohim. And Elohim, you will find them referred to in very scant sources in the Old Testament. One in particular, the book of Psalms, where God is talking to the Elohim. And this is the language that's used there. He's passing judgment on them, proving that he's, at least by the Hebrew text, that God, Elohim, is chief over the rest of these Elohim. And he uses, it says this in the Psalm 82 passage. It says, and Elohim stood, singular act, in the midst of the Elohim, plural. And he, singular, said to them, plural, you are all Elohim, or gods, the bright shining princes of heaven. But then he goes on to say, but I can strip your immortality from you and you will die like men. And he passes judgment on them for something. It doesn't say what. But this ties back to things that happen in creation. The Garden of Eden story, the Noah and the Ark story, the stories in the book of Enoch. These Elohim are all beings that are equated to the same name used for the singular God. So the word Elohim is a word much like our English word for deer. It can be used plurally or singularly, depending on the context of the passage. I see a deer in my front yard, singular. I see a herd of deer in my backyard, plural. The word is used pretty much the same way. And so what I have found in studying this out just in the Old Testament is that, and here I don't mean to offend anybody's religious or spiritual sensibilities. If you're Christian or Jewish, my whole background is Christian, evangelical Christian. And this opened up my eyes, too, after many years of studying this, is that the Bible does not teach monotheism. The Bible teaches that there is a pantheon of gods, much like you would see patterned, they were patterned after in things like the Greek gods, where you have Zeus and this cast of gods, or the Roman gods, or the different cultures that had these pantheons of gods. This is the exact same thing you find in the Old Testament. And these are the beings that descended down, the Bnei Ha-Elohim, the sons of God, the watchers who came down and impregnated human women and bequeathed this race. And it ties into other aspects of this. When the book of Enoch talks about these beings also bringing the forbidden knowledges of God, that were forbidden for mankind to know, and they in a sense, bred up humans, and they gave them knowledge that they weren't supposed to have. You start looking at all the other ancient cultures that tell this same tale, where you have, like in the Sumerian culture, you've got their caste of gods, the Anunnaki, who came down. They were called the star gods, who came down to the earth. And they found humans roving the fields and the swamps as wild bands of beasts, and they bred them up, and they taught them forbidden knowledge, and they enslaved them. And then one of the gods broke away from the pantheon of the Sumerian gods and was their freedom fighter, saw the plight of the humans, and he taught them forbidden knowledge and bred them up, and was forever condemned, he and his followers, to dwell in the subterranean caverns of the earth. You have Quetzalcoatl of the Mayan culture, the winged serpent god, or feathered serpent god, who came down and taught forbidden knowledges to humans, and the rest of the gods condemned and executed him for it. You have Krishna in the Hindu religion, who sat in this beautiful garden underneath a banyan tree on a coiled serpent and disseminated the forbidden knowledges of the gods and gave it to the humans and was condemned and executed for it. And you see this theme repeated over and over and over and over again in ancient religious cultures. And some of these cultures, and this is what threw the wrench in the gears for some of the things I believed by faith in Christianity, was that, say, the Sumerian culture, their stories that so coincide with the stories of the Bible happened 3,000 years prior to the writing of the Old Testament Scripture. Moses would have been the author of the book of Genesis. I see no reason to doubt that. I think he was a real guy. He wrote the book of Genesis right around 1400 BC. Well, the Sumerian culture lived 4500 to 4800 BC, and they had these stories that had these same gods, these same characters, these same events that took place to humans. And they parallel the story of the Garden of Eden and the stories that you find in Scripture. So when you start looking at this, you say, ancient mankind put religion onto the things that they encountered in order to be able to describe them and to better understand them, and they built their religions around them.
Do you know how confusing it is there, Scott, to actually go out there and find a church that is going to lead you on the right path? For example, my sister goes to a Christian church, and she actually, she knows I do radio, and I asked her to bring up the Book of Enoch. Well, she brings up the Book of Enoch to one of her ministers, and they just kind of give her a look like, whoa, why do you want to talk about that? That's not Scripture. Why is that? I mean, where is this book? Where can people get this book or read it? Is it online? Can you buy it?
I tell you what, you can go to Amazon.com and find the Book of Enoch, where you've got editors who've taken, and there's actually a brand new edition that's just come out very recently of new translation work done on the original languages of the Book of Enoch. You just go on to Amazon.com, type in the Book of Enoch, and you will find this book. And what's interesting about the Book of Enoch, and I said this to somebody not long ago, I said, the Bible and these Old Testament stories, I said, we get this big religious notion about it because of how we were raised in America and so on. I said, but keep in mind, the Bible is kind of like Lord of the Rings with religion thrown in on top of it. It's this wild story of ancient mankind and ancient happenings to mankind and weird beings and entities that we've all housed in these liturgical cases of angels and gods and demons and all of this, and so it loses that edginess to it because we put it all in the category of religion. When you step out of that box for a second and look back in and start comparing it to other religions, you will start finding that this story it's huge, it's spooky, it's scary, and it will challenge you to the foundational core of what you think you believe, especially if you were raised Judeo-Christian. You're going to look at this and say, wait a minute, something rings different here. This is a much bigger story. I got to tell you, when I was in Bible college and seminary and ministry, the world and the universe were a very, very small place because it was all God. God ruled it all. He was benevolent over it all. If there were aliens, there was always a curiosity, but it was always poo-pooed in my circle. Oh, of course not. God created the universe for mankind. And, you look at that story, and it's a very small universe. And when you start stepping outside of that for a second, not to necessarily doubt your faith or doubt who God is or anything like that, like I say, I'm not trying to distract from religion or from people's spirituality, but when you step outside just to research it for a minute or look back in on it, it looks just like everything else that's out there.
Yeah, one thing that got me, Scott, looking back at the Bible is I'm not really that familiar with the book, but there is one story that did stand out to me, and it was these guys and girls that were building a tower to get closer to God. It got so high, and God broke it down or something, and then cast everybody around and created different languages. Are you familiar with that?
I am the Tower of Babel story.
I mean, if he's so concerned about a tower, well, I mean, what about the Apollo missions and the space station?
Well, I think you've got some of the same things going on there. Now, of course, when you start getting into some of this stuff that makes a lot of sense and you try to talk about it, you got to realize what we're doing is we're speculating. There's no real proof for any of this. There's no proof that God existed. There's no proof that there were such things as Nephilim or angels or anything like that. What you get with this story, though, where you can't apply the scientific method, and I'm getting up to this with the Tower of Babel, while you can't apply the scientific method per se, what you can do is apply a certain form of the scientific method by saying there are so many cultures that speak of the same thing, that we're not connected, but they all have their version of the same story. This is telling you one thing, that underlying story, that subtext to all of them, is something that probably is very close to what really happened. And when you start looking at this, you start taking stories like the Tower of Babel, the Garden of Eden story. All of these stories, they may have an element of truth at the core, like the old saying, it was one of my old seminary professors 25 years ago said to me, he said, Scotty, he says that at the headwaters of every bit of mythology is a kernel of truth. And this is exactly what's going on with all of this. The Tower of Babel is something where I haven't studied this completely, but I have run across this in my research about how this is linked to even some of the ancient alien mythos, if you will. It's talking about how mankind had been bred up and then bred down and then bred up and bred down, and where I was talking to Whitley Strieber. If you don't know who he is, he runs the Dreamland radio show, and he wrote the book Communion many years ago and several books after that. And he talks about how perhaps man wasn't bred up, perhaps we were bred down. And the Tower of Babel is an example of that, where mankind was given almost a collective forgetfulness of certain things bred out of us. So we didn't remember what our roots were and what was at the core, and that there's a reasoning behind all of that. But again, it's all speculative. There's no way to prove there's no way to even prove the Tower of Babel existed. Other than that, it's a story that's housed in some of these same books that talk about these stories that we accept. If you're Judeo-Christian, we accept them by faith that they're true. Oh, yeah, without question. We don't even think about it because that's what we were raised. That's what our church taught. That's what we were taught in Sunday school. But let me ask, when you were taught in Sunday school as a kid, how many times did they pull out the little felt storyboards of Noah and the ark, and Noah with the big white beard and the smiley face, and they built the big ark, and they had all the animals 2 by 2. How many times did you see a Sunday school teacher in the 4th or 5th grade say, and then there were these beings who came down and had sex with the women? And it just didn't happen. Yep. I think this is something that's avoided almost collectively for a couple of reasons. One, it starts to open up a huge can of worms. And number two, I think people don't understand it and they don't know how to approach that, so they avoid it altogether. Because what you've got here is this big story of, call it race interrupted, of a change in the human DNA, a breeding up from external. And we say God created us, yet at the same time, you've got all these stories, as I say, that the scientific method applies when you take all these stories and say they all have this kind of common thread running through them, that humans are a race interrupted. We are a race that was tampered with, if you will, that was bred up. And when you start comparing the religions and the different stories of these beings that came down, intermingled with human women, which indicates they were either all male or all took the form of males, and they bred up the human race. They bred hybrids into the race.
I wanted to ask you, Scott, I'm sorry to interrupt, but when you're talking about breeding up or breeding down, does the Rh negative blood factor tie into this?
I think it does. Now, again, the Rh factor blood is something that we can only speculate is a link to this. But when you start, and now keep in mind, and for your audience as well, the conversation we're having here is like Nephilim light. You can only hit high points, so trust me, there's a lot of information in between all these points I'm making here. that you'd have to, it'd take years, take volumes to write about it all. But what you've got when you start getting into the Rh negative, the Rh blood factor altogether, is something that was discovered in human blood in the 50s, and they said that there is no DNA linkage to anything else on this planet. It is an anomaly in and of itself, this Rh factor in the human blood, and it's rare in human blood. And one of the speculative theories on the Rh negative blood is that this is the linkage to some of that breeding that was done to humans, that it was bred into us and it's spread out. And what this indicates to me is something that's told in the whole Old Testament, and that's the story of a dual bloodline in the human race. A bloodline that is representative of pure human blood, if you will, and one that is representative of mixed human blood with something else. And this is where the tie-ins start to speculatively be made with the Rh factor in blood, is to say this is something else that's in our blood that's not identifiable by anything else on the planet. And, of course, your scientists can go, I wonder if this is alien blood. I don't think they did that. They just said, we have no way of identifying what this is, and still to this day, there is no way of identifying that. So the theory, a working theory, a speculative theory, is that the Rh factor in human blood is that remnant, if you will, of this interbreeding, of this breeding up or breeding down, the mixing of the bloodlines. And it ties into all these theories and trust me, this stuff can start to sound so whack fringe, if you will, that if you don't speak of it in as factual or scientific or reasoned overtones, you start to sound like a crackpot or an idiot. But this stuff ties into all the theories, whether they be wacky theories or very reasoned theories of extraterrestrial, if you will, not of this earth races that have interfered and intermingled in the human bloodstream and that are constantly warring with each other, that are constantly working behind the scenes. You've got guys that have whole political movements today. David Icke, who has a big movement based on the whole theory that reptilians are a race that is more intraterrestrial, that maybe have been one time from outside this planet, but now are within the planet, that work behind the scenes, that are very powerful, behind even theories of and people will call this even crackpot theories, the theories of Illuminati and things like that, that these things work even behind those scenes, governing the affairs of this planet. And the idea is to eventually take over, and that there are, I'll just cut to the chase and say there are many theories that say that there are two, if you will, extraterrestrial, interterrestrial races that work behind the scenes of humanity, the reptilians and the greys. And it even breaks down further than that. There are so many theories, because the problem with all of this is that people who study this stuff, some of them will try to come up with a reasoned approach and say, this is what it looks like. I can't explain it. It starts to look like it fits into this, but I can't prove that. But then you'll have the other ones that will come out and say, well, it's obvious, that the Greys came down and they're at war with the reptilians, and they build this whole story that you say, it sounds like a storybook. Well, doesn't God creating man and placing them in a garden and then man falling because a snake tempted them, that sounds like a storybook too.
Oh, exactly.
So when you start looking at all these stories, you gotta keep asking the questions. Where do they start to tie together? And if they tie together, does that mean there is something beneath the surface, a subtext of something real going on? You can't prove any of it. That's the problem. And the only people who can prove it, it's like I was talking to Whitley Strieber again, and he is one of those, if you will, and I said it to him on his show. I said, Whitley, you are one of those crackpot nutcase weirdos, because you have experienced it. You have met these characters in your own experience, and you have a very different perspective on this. But because only you have, in your experience, there's no way to prove it, you become the crackpot.
Now, I'm going to ask you straight up, Scott, do you believe that aliens really tie into religion? Do you believe that God could actually be an extraterrestrial? Is that...
Sure.
Okay.
Sure, without question.
What do you say to people that are going to church and they're getting belittled for bringing up these things that I believe, and many others believe, should be brought up?
Well, I think the big danger that humankind has is when we take any theory or any story and we start to apply religion to it. When you apply religion, you have to, of necessity, start applying dogma and theology and systematic theology. And when you start applying religion, dogma, systematic theology to a story, you suddenly start to close the windows and the doors down because you have to fit your religion within a certain framework. And and this is what happens. Even nowadays, when people create religions out of some of this stuff, and and they exist out there. There are people who built religions in modern day out of some of these tales. The problem you have when you build a religion is that you close yourself off. You start to, just like take a Baptist or a Catholic or a Jew or a Hindu, less Hindu than others because they have a different form of religion, but these religions that have this grid work of theology built around them, you can't violate that theology within and still be part of your religion. So where I say, I'm still Christian, I haven't thrown out the baby with the bathwater, but I have huge questions. God is not the same God I once thought he was. He's become something very different. If there is more than one of him, and him I use as an easy descriptor, then what does that do to my theology in evangelical Christianity? What does that do to Christ for me? And let me say on that point, I got to say this. The whole story of the Messiah, all throughout the Old Testament, the coming Messiah, the Messiah who would come, that whole story piggybacks the story of this race divided, this interbred race. And remember, in the Hebrew sensibility, the word Messiah meant kinsman redeemer. It was the Redeemer who had to be one of us, of pure human blood. If you've ever gone to church at Christmas time and heard a preacher say something like, and Jesus came as one of us. He was one of us. Glory and all of this stuff they'll say. And it's a watered-down version of the old Hebrew sensibility that the Messiah was known as the kinsman redeemer. And this begs a huge question. If the whole theology of the kinsman redeemer, the Messiah, was built on there being a redeemer that had to be of pure human blood, why was that pointed out so strongly all through the Old Testament if there was not something to contrast it with?
Oh, I
If
completely agree.
there was only pure human blood, why would you have to say he had to be of pure human blood? Well, what else could he be of? It's all established in the Garden of Eden story, which, in a nutshell, we know that story too. Adam and Eve, formed by God, put in the garden to till the land and keep it for him. And the snake comes, the serpent character, and tempts Eve, and she eats the apple, gives it to Adam, fruit. He eats the fruit, and poof, they're both naked all of a sudden. And I always wondered what nakedness had to do with the story. Why was that the earmark of why they had fallen? And then, of course, God comes down and curses everybody in the fall of man. And what's interesting is that here, let me give you a pop quiz.
Okay. I'll probably fail miserably, but
I think you'll get this one. It's pretty easy.
All right.
There's no trick question here. Who were we always taught was the serpent in the Garden of Eden?
Well, that would be the devil.
The devil, Satan, Lucifer. Now, what's interesting is that none of those names or titles appears in the passage in the Hebrew text. Lucifer, Satan, the devil, aren't even applied to him. They're attributed thousands of years later to him. The word used in the Genesis story of the Garden of Eden for the snake in the garden was Nakash. And Nakash meant, by definition, this in the Hebrew. Nakash meant trickster. It meant crafty magician. It meant the bringer of knowledge, the illuminator, the bright shining one. As a matter of fact, a form of the same word Nakash is used when Moses is leading the children of Israel out of Egypt, and they're wandering in the wilderness for years, and they're all complaining, and so there's all these snakes that start biting them, and Moses crafts a bright, shining bronze serpent and raises it up on a pole, and all the people have to do is look to the snake, and they're healed of the snake bites. Well, the same word is used for that snake, the Nakash, and it's a variation of the word. Well, Nakash was the serpent character in the Garden of Eden story, And the whole emphasis, the whole context of the story of the Garden of Eden is one of sexual encounter. And it's proven by the things that happen immediately after that fall of man. God comes down and he says to the first thing he says to the serpent, and this is, by the way, something that is accepted in rabbinic scholarship or Jewish scholarship of the text, as well as Christian. There's almost no deviation from this. And that God comes down when he's cursing the serpent, and he utters the first messianic prophecy, the prophecy of the kinsman redeemer. He says to the serpent, he tells him, on your belly you shall go, and all of this. But then he says, and there will be a day when you will bruise his heel, but he will return and crush your head. And that's all it says. And you think, well, what does that mean? Well, according to all these scholars, for centuries, all this means, this is the prophecy of the Messiah, the first prophecy of a kinsman redeemer. So that's the first thing God says in the garden. And then the next thing he says is this. He looks at them all, and he says, and there will be constant, perpetual enmity or conflict between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, or the seed of humankind. And then he goes on from there all through the Old Testament to establish all the genealogies that trace the pure human bloodline. You get to Noah right after the initial story of the Nephilim coming down and intermingling with the daughters of men, and God chooses Noah. We're taught, according to the Scripture, taught that because he was a righteous man and pure in all his generations, it says. Until you look at it in the Hebrew, righteous isn't the word used there. The word used there means pure-blooded man who was pure in all his generations back to Adam. That takes on a whole different tone. Why was Noah chosen? Because he was one of the few families left, or maybe even the only family left, untainted by the mixed blood of the Nephilim. And this is why he was chosen. And then you get up to King David thousands of years later, and they trace David's lineage back to Adam. But they don't trace it through Cain, the firstborn. They trace it through Seth, the thirdborn. Because now, if you remember, here's what happened in the Garden of Eden. Remember, right afterwards, Eve bears sons, and they're twin sons, Cain and Abel. Cain murders his brother because he's jealous that God accepts his brother and not him. And Cain then is cast out. He's banished, and he travels off. Well, Cain is the firstborn, but Cain is the son of Eve and Nakosh, while Abel was the son of Eve and Adam. And remember, when she bears her third son, Seth, she says, God has given me a man-child to replace my lost man-son, Abel. And so you've got the two bloodlines established there. And the way to establish even that is just to go into religious mythology and look at all the different creation first family stories that exist in 1,000+ different ancient cultures. They talk about the first family, and there is always a trickster character that comes in and either impregnates the wife of the first couple or the daughter of the first couple, and they always bear multiples, like twins or triplets or quadruplets. And even the Lakota story is one I quote in my book, where in the Lakota legend, the Sioux, Native American, they had, and I can't remember the names of the man and the woman, but they come up out of the subterranean caverns of the earth and see the sunlight for the first time, the act of creation. And they have a daughter, and Iktopi, the trickster character of the gods, comes in and loves the daughter and marries her, and she impregnates her, and she bears multiples. And this is widespread across cultures. So what you've got is, when David, where I started with this, they trace him all the way back to Adam. They don't trace him through the firstborn son, which is the Hebrew tradition. Why? They trace him through the third son, Cain. Seth. Why do they do that? Because Cain was the offspring of the tainted blood of Nakosh, the Elohim, and the human woman. And the reason I get Nakosh being the Elohim, it says that he is Nakosh, the trickster character, the bright shining one. Take that back to Psalm 82, where it says, and Elohim said to the Elohim, you are all the Elohim of heaven, the gods of heaven, the bright shining princes of heaven. And this bright shining element is connected to the Elohim. So the Elohim, this caste of gods, ruled over by the chief god Elohim. is the same as the character as Nakosh, the bright shining Prince of Heaven in the Garden of Eden, the sons of God, the Bene Elohim, who come down and impregnate human women before the flood story. Go to the, this is one of the more outstanding ones, and this is why I quote it, but and one of my favorites because I'm Celtic heritage. I'm Scottish and I'm Welsh, and so I love all things Celtic by heritage. And you go to the ancient Celts story of these characters, and they're called the Tuatha De Danann, the children of the goddess Danu, the Tua, or the Tuath, as they're referred to. The Tuatha De Danann, the ancient Celts referred to them as the bright shining kings who descended from heaven and ruled among them and impregnated and taught forbidden knowledges, and there were great wars that drove them into the Celtic mythologies of the Hollow Hills is where they receded, and they became known as the Elven folk. And the Elven folk still bears that earmark, that name of God, the El, the Elohim, the Elven folk. And you see these ties in all these different cultural stories that talk about the Garden of Eden story is where it all started. It was right at the get-go in the Hebrew story. This is just the Hebrew version of these events that took place. And the story of the Messiah, which started right as God is cursing them all at the fall, that story of the kinsman redeemer is carried through the whole Old Testament, through all the genealogies. And you get to Noah. What does it say about Noah? He was not the perfect man. He was the only pure-blooded man, pure in all his generations. You've got David, who they trace back to Noah, and then back to Adam, but not through Cain, the firstborn, but through Seth. Then you go to Mary, the mother of Jesus, and her the followers of Jesus in the New Testament trace Mary back to King David to establish something that came up about the Messianic line after the time of David, was that the Messiah would now also have to become from the lineage of David to prove that he was of the royal house ruling class of King David in Israel. So they trace Mary's family all the way back to David to prove that Jesus was the firstborn son and had the rightful heir to the throne of David. But then they also trace it again back through Noah and to Adam, but not through Cain, the firstborn, traditional, but through Seth, the thirdborn, because Cain was not of pure human blood, but Abel and Seth were.
Now, Scott, we are getting a couple Facebook messages here. People are sending in. We got Rachel, or Rochelle, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong, from Erie, asking what your blood type is. Now, that's a pretty interesting question.
You know, I knew it one time. And I can't think of what it is right now. I'm not RH, though.
You know what? That makes me feel better, though, because I didn't know my blood type until a couple of weeks ago.
What is yours?
RH negative.
There you go. Well, you know, so, and the going theory with that.
You want to know something, too? I'm a twin. Yeah. Twins run in my family, and half of my family has the RH negative factor.
Well, it's interesting. I have twin daughters. So, what's interesting about this, though, is that you might be, and I say might because there's no way to prove it, you might have this rare or this remnant gene in your bloodstream. Because it's interesting. The flood was brought, at least in the Hebrew story, and if it correlates with all these other stories, the flood was brought by the divinity, God, Elohim, to wipe out this race. And yet it says, but they were on the earth in those days and also afterward. You see when Moses leads the children of Israel out of Egypt and they go to the promised land, about 3 months later they make it there. And they go and they send in spies, and the spies come back and say, we can't go in there. There's giants there, they called them. They said they are, and I think it's more figurative than it was literal, but they said we look like grasshoppers in their sight, and the grapes are so big we can't carry them. So they're talking about even the fruit of the land there. But then they say they are giants. That's in one translation in the English, but it's a mistranslation, the word giants there. Giants, they say they are the Nephilim, the children of Anak. You get to the famous story of David and Goliath, and it says Goliath was from this town of Gath, and he had 3 other brothers, and they were all these giant warrior types. And we lost our connection there somewhere.
It's kind of funny. It happens, man. It happens.
It does. And as I used to say when I was doing radio, this is scintillating live radio, folks.
Yes, yes, exactly. So it's not so far-fetched for me to say I might have some Nephilim blood flowing through my veins.
It's not far-fetched. No, it's not. And until it is proven that is something else, right now it is a random element in the human blood that cannot be identified. And it gets tied into all these mythologies, if you will. And so it is a speculative point. Now, there's some guys that have worked. There's a guy named Anthony F. Sanchez, who wrote the book UFO Highway. And it's not as trite a book as it sounds. He goes very deep into things, but he has several chapters he spent on identifying this blood type and the genetics of human beings. As a matter of fact, he even brought up the point that it was once thought that 93% of our DNA is related to primates. Now, that's old DNA research. The newer research in the recent, 8 years has shown that percentage point has dropped to almost 67%, which means what was once thought to be 93%, which is as close as you can get without being a primate, 67%. We share 7% of our DNA with every life on this planet. Share that much DNA, and so our connection to primates has dropped exponentially. Now it's just speculative, and so when you bring that factor in, what does that mean? The theory of evolution starts to be turned on its ear.
Yes,
especially the evolutionary ascendancy of mankind being from primates. And so this RH factor in the blood, you may very well carry that remnant stream.
That's kind of scary, because if God wanted to flood the earth to destroy those beings, my goodness, I wonder where I'm heading.
Yeah.
And I feel I'm a pretty good guy. But let me ask you this, bud. If let's say a Christian that is, let's give him the age of 40, all his life, he's been going to church, the Bible, the King James Version, that's the way, no way. What's going to change whenever he opens up the book of Enoch and he starts reading it? What is going to pretty much open his eyes? What's the biggest thing in that book?
I think it's not so much a particular part of that book as it is elements in that book that start to relate to other things throughout history. And I think these are some of the discussion points that had to have gone on in the councils, like the Council of Nicaea, when they're trying to determine the scripture or the veracity of the God-breathedness of this scripture, is that they could not come to terms with it because it opened up this huge gaping hole in theology. So what you're going to find is when these beings are talked about as being now, I told you what the book of Genesis says about the Nephilim. It's covered in about 4 verses. In the book of Enoch, it talks about 200 of these characters, the sons of God, known as the Watchers, the Bene Ha-Elohim, that they descended to the earth and touched their feet on the slopes of Mount Hermon, which is a mountain that sits in the north of Israel. It's there today. You can go to Mount Hermon. It straddles the Golan Heights between the borders of Syria and Lebanon in northern Israel.
33 degrees stands out to me.
Still today. And I was talking to Bill Burns from UFO Hunters and Ancient Aliens, good friend of mine, very much a scholar beyond the realm of the alien issues. But he talked about the importance of the Golan Heights, and that mountain is sitting right there. He said this is part of the importance of that mountain, are the spiritual connections to it. And it says that these 200 came down and they settled on the slopes of Mount Hermon and made this pact with each other to go in amongst humans and interbreed with them. And that their leader, Shemyaza, said, no, we can't do this. My head's on the block if you do this. And they said, we don't care, we're going to do this anyway. And they did it. And it says they brought all these forbidden knowledges. Now, there's something interesting about Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon, and this ties into something else that starts linking all this ancient alien theory in. Here's a book of Scripture, Hebrew Scripture, whether you believe it's part of the Bible or not, or whether the Council of Nicaea was right in booting it out or not, it was originally written as Hebrew Scripture. Mount Hermon, where they touched down, sits on the 33rd parallel north of the equator.
Mm-hmm. I was just about to go into this, yes. Now,
you trace the 33rd parallel in a straight line around the Earth to the exact global opposite spot on the 33rd parallel, and you end up at the crash site of Roswell, New Mexico.
Exactly.
And now you say that is either one huge geo-global coincidence, or it's a huge fraud, a huge conspiracy theory done to build this theory, or it is something that is unexplainable. And when you start looking at all the different ancient sites, I mean thousands of years old, dotted around the globe, how many of these things are on straight connecting lines with each other? There's a grid that circumferences the earth and ties in all these ancient sites. Places in Central America link up exactly with places on the other side of the planet, where you end up in places like Thailand and some of the ancient sites there. Now, I don't know exactly which ones correlate. I don't have a globe in front of me, but all these ancient sites start dotting together in straight lines. It's like connecting these dots, and you get this big grid. The 33rd parallel north, the same thing. 33 is the number of what? Illumination. When you go by numerology, it's the number of illumination. Think of the illuminator, the bright shining ones, and all of this. You've got this the number of illumination being the line that circumferences the earth, that travels around the earth and makes a direct line through to another very ancient alien connected site. And when you start looking at this stuff, you say there's something that has a greater hand in things here. And could this be? It's either one of two things to me. It's either it's exactly what I learned. It's God and everything else as you read it in the Bible, just the mysteries of God that are surrounding it all, or it's something completely different, that God takes on a very different personage, a very different tone, something that was very interesting to me. Even though I grew up believing in God and Jehovah God and Elohim and all of these, you go back 3,000 years to that Sumerian story I told you about with their gods, the Anunnaki, and you find this in the cuneiform texts where it talks about their gods. Elil, E-L-I-L, was the chief god of the Anunnaki, and his brother god was Enki, also known as Ea in the Akkadian culture, the neighboring culture to the Sumerians. So Elil was the chief of the gods that helped to subjugate, or they bred up humans. They subjugated them, enslaved them, and they had them doing things like tilling the ground for them, producing crops, mining natural resources for them, and they were enslaved. His brother, Enki, also known as Ea, we'll call him Enki-Ea, Enki-Ea saw the plight of the humans and became, in essence, the first freedom fighter. He descended with his followers to the earth, and he freed the humans from captivity. And he taught them forbidden knowledges and bred them up, and for this he was condemned. Now, here's the interesting thing where you start to see correlations. He did this, Enki-Ea did this from a place in the Euphrates River Valley known as the Den of Serpents, or it was also commonly referred to in the text as Ea's Den, or Ea Den. And from Ea Den, he freed the humans. He taught them the forbidden knowledges, and the serpent is connected to that. The Den of Serpents is where he was. And he freed them and was condemned for this. Now, the Anunnaki had enslaved humans to do what? Look at the Genesis story of Adam and Eve. God took Adam and Eve and placed them in the garden to till the ground and keep it for him. In the Sumerian story 3,000 years earlier, Elil and the gods of the Anunnaki had the humans tilling the ground for them, producing natural crops and then mining natural resources only under enslavement. Elil, the chief god, E-L-I-L, Elil is the same base word, etymologically speaking, with the evolution of culture and religion as it spread from the Fertile Crescent over the next 3,000 years down into the Canaanite region, where the Hebrews picked up the name El, E-L, and Elil became, over that evolution of the word and the language, became Elohim, El Shaddai, El, the name for God. Then you have Enki, Ea. Ea, over that same 3,000 years as religion and mankind spread down into the Canaanite regions, the Hebrews picked up Ea. Ea is the same base word for Y-W-H-W, Yahweh, Yahweh, which is the same name as Jehovah. And when you start making all these comparisons, you say, wait a minute. Did Moses, the writer of Genesis, just pick up on these gods and write them into Hebrew culture and Hebrew religion? Because that's exactly what happened, at least anthropologically speaking, historically speaking. So what you've got here in the Old Testament, when you start looking at all these stories, the stuff that you find in the book of Enoch, talking about the Watchers and Mount Hermon and the forbidden knowledges, and compare that to all these other cultures, they all start to look alike. And then the Hebrew stories start to look like stories that were built on top of older stories, just changing the names a little bit to use them for the Hebrew gods. So you ask the question, if you're 40 years old and have been a Christian or a Jew your whole life and you've learned these things, what do you do when you run across these stories in the book of Enoch? And you run across these stories, but also, you know what it did for me? I'm 51 years old, and I got to tell you, when I was about 40 was when all this stuff really started.
That's funny.
For me. Yeah, funny coincidence there, but what it has done for me, I remember when I finished writing this book, The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim, last September.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about that. Where do people get that? What do they expect in this book?
Where can they find the book?
Yes, yeah, your website, everything.
Yeah, well, let me tell you a couple of things. As my publisher would say, it's available everywhere books are sold, which is really true. You can go to any bookstore and find it. Smaller ones, maybe not so easily. But the easiest place would obviously be Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com, BN.com. And you can find the book there. And I am already writing the follow-up book for this. The title is The Secret History of the Reptilians, and it's subtitled The Pervasive Presence of the Serpent Throughout Human History, Religion, and Alien Mythos. And that's, I'm supposed to be done with that in a month, so wish me luck.
You better get going.
That book comes out in February. But you can find that, you can go to my website. I publish Intrepid Magazine. You can go to intrepidmag.com, and there's links for the book in there. Warwick Associates is the PR firm for New Page Books. You can find it everywhere. If I can put in one quick plug here, we are putting, if this stuff is interesting to you, we are putting on a huge symposium here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now, a lot of people say, oh, Minneapolis, I don't live there. You don't have to. When I was with the Ghost Hunters and the editor of their magazine, we travel all over the country, and people came all over to these events. This is an event in Minneapolis, October 18th through the 21st this year, called the Paradigm Symposium. And if this stuff interests you, the speakers we have are phenomenal. I mean, it makes me go, how did we pull this off? We've got Eric von Daniken, who wrote Chariots of the Gods some years ago.
Great book right there.
He's speaking here. His first American appearance in almost 10 years. We have George Norrie from Coast to Coast.
There's a good one.
From the History Channel, H2's show, Ancient Aliens, we have Giorgio Tsoukalos, Philip Coppens, Bill Burns, all coming to speak. Ian Punnett, who did the Weekend Coast. Oh,
yeah. You got the creme of the creme coming to that.
We got about 10 authors you'd recognize, too. Marie D. Jones, Larry Flaxman, Laird Scranton, John Ventry from MUFON. I've got my friend Dr. John Ward, archaeologist, anthropologist from Luxor, Egypt, who lives in the dusty backwaters of the just right on this side of the Nile side of the Valley of the Kings. He's coming to speak on mythology and symbology and how it ties into the Cathars and the Templars and Herefordshire and all of that, where he's from. And so we've got all these guys coming. And if you're interested in this, just go check it out. You can go to intrepidmag.com and click on the Paradigm Symposium link, or just go to paradigmsymposium.com.
Now, Scott, we're about out of time here, but I like to do this at the end of every one of my shows. Anybody out there listening right now that you might have something that you really want to get across to them, what's your final word on tonight's show? What do you want to tell anybody out there listening?
Oh, boy. I would say what this has all come down to for me is think for yourself. It doesn't matter how you were raised or what religion you were taught, as hard as it is, and it's hard for me, I got to tell you. There are days I wrestle with my old faith. But as hard as it is, step outside the box. Look back in and ask the questions. I've even found myself praying to God and said, God, throw me a bone, show me something. And I even had an old pastor friend of mine said, maybe God did. Maybe you're finding out things you didn't want to know. And so I would encourage you, do you want to live your life? I put it this way. The late Richard Feynman, quantum physicist, contemporary of Oppenheimer and Einstein, he said, there's a lot of things in this world I know a lot about. He says, and there's a lot of things I don't know much about, but I know something about. He said, there's very vast number of things I know absolutely nothing about. And he was speaking of religion. He says, and when it comes to this, he says, I would rather die not knowing the answers to some things than living my whole life believing something that I later find out to be untrue. And so I would say to you this, is it's going to challenge your faith. It's going to challenge the way you think. But step outside the box and look in and ask the questions. Don't let somebody else tell you what to believe. Figure it out. Find it. Root it out. And see what it says.
I would actually agree with you 100% on that. Scott, I want to thank you for coming on the show. We'll have to bring you back. I know you said your book is due out in February. You're supposed to have it done in a month, so you better get cracking.
I'm cracking.
I really appreciate you coming on. We'll definitely get you back on, buddy. And God bless you.
Thanks, Shawn, and God bless you too, my friend.
Good night, my friend.
Have a good night.